Medical studies suggest the human brain can retain consciousness for several seconds after decapitation. These seconds of potential awareness, where the eyes might flutter and lips might twitch, represent a grotesque possibility that haunted the final moments of Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's doomed second queen. On May 19th, 1536, this biological horror was merely the culmination of a far more sinister campaign designed to destroy not just her body, but her very existence. The true horror of Anne Boleyn's execution lies not in the swift stroke of continental steel, but in the documented campaign of psychological warfare, fabricated evidence, and political theatre that preceded it. Historical records reveal this was no simple beheading, but the culmination of the most sophisticated character assassination in Tudor England. What follows is the story of Anne's final 17 days, where the systematic destruction of truth itself proved more terrifying than the blade that would end her life. Chapter 1. The Cage of Lies. The systematic destruction of Anne Boleyn began on May 2nd, 1536, when she was arrested at Greenwich Palace and transported by barge to the Tower of London. Tower records and contemporary correspondence from Sir William Kingston, the Tower's constable, provide detailed evidence of the psychological campaign that preceded her physical execution. Anne's imprisonment in the same royal apartments where she had prepared for her coronation 3 years earlier was no accident. The Tower's lieutenant deliberately housed her in these chambers, creating a psychological torment that Kingston documented in his letters to Thomas Cromwell. Every corridor she walked as a prisoner, she had once traversed as England's future queen. This calculated irony formed the foundation of her mental torture. The charges against Anne were unprecedented in their scope and audacity. Contemporary court records show she was accused of adultery with 5 different men, including Henry Norris, William Breton, Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton, and most shockingly, her own brother George Boleyn. Additional charges included conspiracy to murder the king through poison and witchcraft, and high treason for allegedly plotting Henry's death so she could marry one of her supposed lovers. Cromwell's interrogation strategy, documented in surviving court papers, relied on sleep deprivation and psychological manipulation. Tower records show Anne was subjected to questioning sessions that stretched deep into the night, with deliberate disruptions of her sleep patterns designed to weaken her mental defenses. Kingston's correspondence reveals she was kept in a constant state of anxiety about when the next interrogation would begin. The evidence against Anne was entirely circumstantial, constructed through coerced confessions and manipulated testimony. Mark Smeaton confessed to adultery with the Queen, though contemporary accounts suggest this confession was obtained through torture. The other accused men maintained their innocence throughout their imprisonment, with witness accounts recording their continued protests of both their own and Anne's innocence. Perhaps most devastating was Anne's forced isolation from any supporters. Kingston's letters document how her former allies suddenly found themselves unable to visit or provide comfort. The few servants allowed to attend her were carefully selected for their loyalty to the crown rather than their former mistress. This strategic severing of her support network left Anne psychologically alone at her moment of greatest need. Contemporary accounts reveal Cromwell's particularly cruel tactic of forcing Anne to hear the false confessions extracted from her alleged co-conspirators. These testimonies, documented in court records, were obtained from men tortured until they would say anything to stop their suffering. The psychological impact of hearing these fabricated accounts, knowing they came from tortured men, caused visible distress that witnesses recorded. The timing of her trial was repeatedly manipulated as another form of documented psychological torture. Kingston's correspondence shows Anne was told she would die on certain days, only to have the execution postponed at the last moment. This deliberate uncertainty about when death would come was designed to prevent her from achieving any psychological peace or dignity in preparation for her end. The trial itself, held on May 15th, 1536, was a predetermined conclusion. Court records show the jury included her uncle Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, and her former fiancé Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland. Contemporary accounts describe Percy collapsing when the guilty verdict was announced, requiring assistance to leave the courtroom. He died childless 8 months later. By the time Anne faced her accusers, witness accounts describe a woman whose spirit had been systematically broken. Kingston documented periods of unusual cheerfulness, alternating with episodes of weeping and despair. She exhibited what modern medicine would recognize as dissociation, speaking of herself in the third person and making gallows humor about her impending death. The fabricated nature of the evidence was so comprehensive that even some contemporary observers expressed doubt. Foreign ambassadors noted the weak nature of the case, though political considerations prevented open criticism of Henry's proceedings. The manufactured evidence created an alternate reality so pervasive that it influenced historical interpretation for centuries. Most tellingly, the executions of her alleged co-conspirators were scheduled for May 17th, 2 days before Anne's own death. This timing served multiple purposes, eliminating any possibility that their final speeches might contradict the official narrative while providing supposed proof of Anne's guilt through their deaths. Chapter 2. The Theatre of Humiliation. Anne Boleyn's execution on May 19th, 1536, was meticulously choreographed political theatre. Every documented detail of her final day reveals careful planning designed to maximize psychological impact and establish precedent for future royal executions. The decision to import a swordsman from Calais rather than use England's traditional executioner was presented as royal mercy. However, contemporary accounts reveal this choice as calculated theatre. The French method was unfamiliar to English audiences, adding exotic spectacle to proceedings that Henry wanted remembered. Court records show the king paid the substantial sum of £23, 6 shillings and 8 pence for this specialised service. The scaffold constructed on Tower Green was deliberately built at the unusually low height of 3 feet. Surviving architectural records show traditional execution platforms towered much higher, providing condemned nobles with dignity through elevation. Anne's low scaffold kept her closer to the assembled crowd, robbing her of the ceremonial respect typically accorded to royalty, even in death. Tower records reveal the execution was originally scheduled for noon, but postponed to the following morning. Kingston's correspondence documents that insufficient witnesses had arrived, necessitating delay to ensure adequate testimony to the spectacle. This postponement caused Anne visible distress, with Kingston recording her disappointed reaction and plea for the execution to proceed immediately. On the morning of her execution, contemporary accounts describe Anne as having been awake for nearly 24 hours. Tower Chapel records show she requested the sacrament at 2 o'clock in the morning, spending hours in desperate communion. This extended vigil, whether voluntary or enforced, ensured she faced her final moments in a state of physical and mental exhaustion. When Kingston came to fetch her for execution, multiple witnesses recorded Anne's apparent cheerfulness and laughter with her ladies-in-waiting. Modern psychology recognizes such behavior as a trauma response, where the mind attempts to process unbearable horror through dissociation and psychological breakdown rather than genuine peace. The route from her chambers to the scaffold deliberately followed the same path Anne had taken during her coronation procession. Contemporary maps of the tower show this was an intentional choice, forcing Anne to relive her moment of triumph now transformed into a path to death. Guards flanked her not for ceremony but to prevent escape, while courtiers watched with calculated indifference. The crowd's hostile reception was documented by several witnesses. Royal propagandists had spent weeks spreading stories of Anne's alleged crimes through London's taverns and markets, ensuring public opinion was thoroughly poisoned. The carnival-like atmosphere that greeted her appearance was orchestrated, with planted supporters instructed to cheer her death. Anne's final speech, recorded by multiple witnesses, including the French secretary Lancelot de Carle, was carefully constrained. Her words, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it," represent not freedom of expression but its opposite. Even facing death, she could not speak freely, knowing her words would be reported to Henry and could affect her daughter Elizabeth's future. The most cruel aspect was Henry's documented absence from his wife's execution. While Anne knelt on the scaffold, court records show Henry was at Whitehall Palace. Contemporary accounts describe him as cheerful and engaged in planning his upcoming marriage to Jane Seymour, demonstrating his complete emotional detachment from the woman who had once been the centre of his universe. The French swordsman's unfamiliarity to Anne added another layer of calculated indignity. In her final moments, she faced death at the hands of a complete stranger rather than an English executioner who might represent familiar authority. This foreign presence emphasized her isolation and the theatrical nature of her death. The blindfold placed over Anne's eyes served practical rather than merciful purposes. Contemporary accounts of executions reveal blindfolds prevented victims from flinching at crucial moments, which could result in botched beheadings that would spoil the spectacle. The blindfold ensured the dramatic climax would proceed without complications. Anne knelt upright, rather than placing her head on a traditional block, following French custom that made the executioner's task more challenging but provided better visual drama for witnesses. Contemporary accounts describe her lips moving continuously in prayer, her body trembling with the effort of remaining motionless while death approached. The scaffold environment itself added sensory horror to Anne's final moments. Tower records describe previous executions having taken place in the same location, meaning the wood bore stains and odors from earlier victims. The May warmth would have intensified these conditions, creating a grotesque backdrop for what was supposed to be the dignified execution of England's former queen. The timing of the execution at 8 o'clock in the morning, rather than traditional dawn, allowed for maximum attendance. Contemporary accounts describe substantial crowds of courtiers and Tower officials gathering to witness the unprecedented spectacle of a queen's execution, creating the political theatre Henry desired. Chapter 3. The Moment of Severance. At approximately 8 o'clock on the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn knelt on the scaffold, her lips moving in silent prayer as the French swordsman prepared to end her life. Contemporary witness accounts provide disturbing details of the execution's immediate aftermath that traumatized even experienced observers of Tudor justice. The executioner's technique required precise coordination. Unlike the heavy English axe that often required multiple blows, the French sword was designed for a single horizontal stroke while the victim knelt upright. Contemporary accounts describe the substantial skill required for this method, explaining why Henry specifically imported expertise from Calais despite the significant expense. Multiple witnesses recorded the moment of execution itself. The swordsman used a distraction technique documented in other French executions, calling for his sword to draw Anne's attention away from his approach. As she turned her head to follow the sound, he struck with devastating precision, severing her head completely in one clean blow. The immediate aftermath created scenes that shocked even hardened observers. Contemporary witness accounts, including those by courtiers present at the execution, describe Anne's eyes and lips continuing to move for several seconds after decapitation. This phenomenon, now understood as residual brain function, created the horrifying appearance of post-mortem consciousness that caused several spectators to faint. Following established protocol, the executioner immediately grasped Anne's severed head by the hair and held it aloft for the crowd to witness. Contemporary accounts describe blood streaming from the severed neck as he displayed the head as proof of completed sentence. This moment provided the climactic visual that witnesses recorded in their letters and memoirs. The poet, Thomas Wyatt, imprisoned in the Tower's bell tower, later wrote of witnessing the execution from his cell window. His contemporary poem captured the grotesque transformation he observed, describing the little throat that had had so many jewels hung about it. His eyewitness account provides one of the most immediate literary responses to the execution's visual horror. Anne's traumatized ladies-in-waiting faced the grim task of preparing her remains. Contemporary accounts describe these women, themselves terrified of potential implication in their mistress's alleged crimes, struggling to handle the severed head and body while maintaining composure before watching crowds. Tower records document their hands shaking uncontrollably as they perform this duty. No proper coffin had been prepared for England's former queen, a detail that speaks to the complete disregard for her dignity. Contemporary sources record that an old arrow chest was hastily located to contain both her head and body. This makeshift burial container emphasized how thoroughly Anne had been reduced from person to inconvenient corpse requiring disposal. The burial procession to the Tower's chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula was brief and without ceremony. Contemporary records show the service was abbreviated, lacking the proper Christian burial rites typically accorded to deceased royalty. No marker was placed to indicate her grave's location, representing the culmination of Henry's campaign to erase Anne from both life and historical memory. Witness accounts document varying degrees of psychological trauma among those forced to observe the execution. Several of Anne's former servants suffered recurring nightmares, while contemporary records show at least one lady-in-waiting eventually entered a convent, unable to continue court life after witnessing such horror. The scaffold was quickly dismantled following the execution, as if the structure itself needed elimination. Contemporary accounts describe the blood-stained wood being burned, though some witnesses later claimed stains remained visible on Tower Green for months afterward, serving as grim reminders of the Queen's violent end. Tower security records reveal extraordinary precautions remained in place for several days after Anne's death. The garrison stayed at double strength, not from fear of rescue attempts, but to prevent any sympathetic demonstrations that might challenge the official narrative of justified execution. The French swordsman departed London immediately after completing his task, taking not only his substantial fee, but also the secret knowledge of Anne's final moments. Contemporary records show his quick exit prevented detailed questioning about the execution's technical aspects, maintaining the official version that emphasized Henry's mercy rather than the Queen's suffering. Court records from the immediate aftermath reveal the systematic nature of the execution's documentation. Multiple witnesses were required to provide written testimony of Anne's death, creating an official record that could be used to justify Henry's actions to foreign courts and future generations. Chapter 4. The Erasure Campaign. Within hours of Anne Boleyn's execution, documented evidence shows a systematic campaign began to eliminate every trace of her existence from England's royal palaces. Court records and contemporary accounts reveal this erasure extended far beyond her physical death, representing an attempt to eliminate an entire historical period from national memory. Contemporary accounts describe court painters receiving immediate orders to destroy or paint over Anne's portraits. Stonemasons were instructed to chisel her royal emblems from palace walls throughout the realm. The famous intertwined H and A that had once symbolized Henry and Anne's union were systematically carved away and replaced with H and J to represent Henry's devotion to Jane Seymour. Palace inventories document the wholesale destruction of material culture associated with Anne. Tapestries bearing her arms were torn down and burned, jewelry engraved with her initials was melted down, and books from her personal library were destroyed if they contained her signature or annotations. This material destruction represented an unprecedented attempt to eliminate physical evidence of a queen's reign. The immediate impact on Anne's daughter Elizabeth was documented by contemporary observers. Within days of her mother's execution, court records show the 3-year-old future queen was declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. The systematic dismantling of Elizabeth's household left the child without appropriate clothing or attendance befitting her former status as princess. Contemporary accounts reveal the sophisticated propaganda campaign that followed Anne's death. Court poets who had previously praised her wit and beauty were commissioned to write verses condemning her moral corruption. Official chronicles were rewritten to minimize her influence and emphasize her alleged crimes, creating an alternate historical narrative so comprehensive it influenced scholarly interpretation for centuries. The climate of fear created by Anne's execution was documented by foreign ambassadors and court observers. Courtiers quickly learned that mentioning Anne's name, even neutrally, could lead to royal disfavor or worse. This enforced silence created institutional memory loss that extended throughout the nobility and court administration. Contemporary medical accounts describe the psychological trauma experienced by execution witnesses. Several ladies-in-waiting suffered what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares and anxiety that contemporary physicians documented in their treatment records. Their suffering was compounded by knowledge that expressing sympathy for Anne could be interpreted as treason. Henry's callous celebration reached its documented peak 11 days after Anne's execution, when he married Jane Seymour on May 30th. Contemporary accounts describe elaborate wedding festivities that deliberately contrasted with the recent execution, sending a clear political message that Anne had been merely an obstacle removed rather than a human being deserving mourning. The coordinated execution of Anne's alleged co-conspirators on May 17th served multiple documented purposes. By eliminating these men before Anne's death, Henry's government prevented any possibility that their final speeches might contradict the official narrative. Their deaths provided supposed evidence of Anne's guilt while silencing potential witnesses to the charge's fabricated nature. International reaction to Anne's execution, documented in diplomatic correspondence, reveals how successfully Henry's propaganda shaped foreign opinion. Ambassadors from France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire reported the event as justified punishment rather than questioning the obviously manufactured evidence, demonstrating the effectiveness of Tudor information control. The modern memorial on Tower Green marking Anne's execution site represents historical confusion documented by Victorian-era records. Contemporary sources place the actual scaffold elsewhere in the Tower complex, but the memorial's location was chosen based on incorrect 19th century assumptions about execution sites. Documentary evidence from the years following Anne's execution shows systematic destruction of records related to her life and reign. Court documents that might have provided alternative perspectives were lost or destroyed. Love letters supposedly proving her adultery were described but conveniently disappeared, creating historical gaps that scholars still struggle to fill. Anne's contributions to England's religious reformation were systematically minimized in official records. Her documented role in promoting Protestant theology and supporting reformist scholars was downplayed or attributed to others, creating a historical narrative that reduced her to a romantic figure rather than acknowledging her significant political and religious influence. The template established by Anne's character assassination, documented in court records and contemporary accounts, would be repeated throughout Tudor history. The combination of fabricated evidence, psychological torture, public humiliation, and historical erasure became a model for eliminating political enemies while maintaining legal appearance. Henry's determination to erase Anne extended to her final resting place. Chapel records show she was buried in an unmarked grave beneath the altar of St. Peter ad Vincula, among other executed nobles. No marker indicated her presence until Victorian renovations in 1876 identified skeletal remains believed to be hers, though historian Alison Weir suggests these bones might actually belong to Catherine Howard. The ultimate irony of Henry's erasure campaign is documented in its spectacular failure. Rather than disappearing from history, Anne Boleyn became one of its most famous figures. Her execution, rather than her achievements, became her most enduring legacy, ensuring Henry's cruelty would be remembered alongside her tragic fate for centuries to come.